Westmont Academy was never a place for change. Founded over a century ago, the school was a sanctuary for the American elite, where every hallway exuded tradition and power. The children of the business aristocracy, politics, and high society strolled through the perfectly manicured gardens without ever having to question their future. For them, success was not a possibility, but a certainty. And among those heirs of destiny was Blake Wellington, a name that, for many, was already synonymous with triumph. The son of the influential Senator Richard Wellington, Blake grew up surrounded by privileges he barely recognized as such. At 17 years old, he carried the arrogance of someone who had never been contradicted and the silent disdain for anyone who was not up to his exclusive world. On the morning that Miss Denise Taylor entered room 204, Blake didn't even need to listen to her introduction to decide he didn't like her. He was the type of person who didn't belong there. Unlike the traditional teachers who bowed to the influence of his family, she seemed indifferent to Westmont's unspoken hierarchy. She wore a simple blazer, but her posture conveyed firmness. Her eyes, attentive, scanned the room without hesitation, as if every student were a puzzle to decipher. Blake crossed his arms and let out an audible sigh, just to make clear his disinterest. But when Miss Taylor announced that that semester would be dedicated to exploring literature and structures of power, a cynical smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He knew that this would be fun. Blake never had to try to stand out at Westmont. He knew exactly how to play the game. Charm when necessary, just the right amount of arrogance, and the unwavering certainty that nothing really mattered beyond his family's reputation. To him, Miss Taylor was just another minor obstacle, a naive teacher who would soon learn how things worked there. That is why, when she began talking about inequality in literature, drawing parallels between the classics and the social structures of the real world, Blake decided he wouldn't let it pass. "How curious," he interrupted, without even raising his hand. "You mean we're going to spend an entire semester learning about victimization?" The class laughed. It wasn't an explosive laugh, but a murmur of complicity. Miss Taylor closed the book she was holding, looking at him unhurriedly. "It depends on what you call victimization, Blake," she replied, with a calm tone that did not match his provocation. "Oh, please. That talk of oppression, inequality, power. We know how the world works. Some work hard and earn. Others choose to blame the system." The room fell into a strange silence. It was not unusual for Blake to confront the teachers, but something in Miss Taylor's demeanor made even the most self-assured students hold back. She could have retorted with a reprimand. She could have called him out. But she did nothing of the sort. She only smiled slightly, as if she were about to present a challenge. "Since you're so sure about how the world works, how about an experiment?" Blake frowned. "What kind of experiment?" Miss Taylor approached the desk and took a sheet of paper. "You have two options. You can do the usual class assignment, an analysis of how the power structures in the classics reflect social inequalities. Or you can accept an alternative challenge. 15 hours of volunteer work at the Riverside Community Center. You choose." This time the laughter in the room was stifled, nervous. Everyone knew that Blake would never accept something like that. He slouched in his chair, arms crossed, a mocking smile on his face. "What if I don't want to do either?" Miss Taylor tilted her head slightly. "Then you receive a 0. But considering your confidence, I imagine you wouldn't be afraid of a little challenge, would you?" The way she said that stirred something uncomfortable inside him. A teacher challenging Blake Wellington? That was new. He looked around, noticing that everyone was waiting for his answer. His pride would not allow him to appear hesitant. "All right," he said, shrugging. "I'll go to that Riverside, but don't expect me to learn anything from it." Miss Taylor simply smiled again, as if she knew something he still didn't. 2 days later, Blake arrived at the Riverside Community Center with the expression of someone about to serve a sentence. The place was exactly as he had imagined. Walls worn by time, a small courtyard, and a library that looked more like a storage room for old books. Children and teenagers moved about the space, some with notebooks in hand, others sitting on the floor playing chess on worn-out boards. The smell of cheap coffee mixed with that of aged paper, and the constant noise of conversations and laughter created a chaotic but lively atmosphere. Blake checked his watch. 15 hours. That's all. He could handle it. He was greeted by a short woman with gray hair pulled into a messy bun and thick-rimmed glasses. Her name was Mrs. Martha, and unlike the teachers at Westmont, she did not seem impressed by his surname or presence. "Are you the boy that Miss Taylor sent?" she asked bluntly. "The very one," he replied, forcing a smile. She examined him for a moment before shaking her head and pointing to a table in the corner. "You're going to help Jamal with math. He's studying for an important exam." Blake bit the inside of his cheek to hold back a sigh. Great. He would spend the afternoon acting as a teacher for a student who, without a doubt, wouldn't understand any of what he said. He walked over to the indicated table and found a slim boy with dark skin, wearing glasses patched together with adhesive tape and a notebook filled with notes written in tiny, cramped handwriting. "Are you the math genius who's going to teach me?" Jamal asked, raising an eyebrow. Blake slouched in his chair, crossing his arms. "Something like that." Jamal pushed the notebook toward him. "Great. Explain this equation here." Blake took a pencil and began writing numbers on the paper, explaining how to solve the problem with the ease of someone who always had access to the best teachers and materials. But after a few minutes, he noticed that Jamal wasn't just listening. He was following every step, reasoning quickly without missing a detail. When Blake finished the explanation, Jamal took the pencil and solved another problem in a matter of seconds. "Did you understand everything all at once?" Blake asked, surprised. Jamal shrugged. "Of course. The hard part isn't understanding. The hard part is learning on your own, without a teacher who really explains things well." For the first time since he had arrived there, Blake didn't know what to say. Blake tried to ignore the strange sensation growing inside him. He had always believed that intelligence was a matter of merit, that the best stood out on their own. But there was Jamal, grasping advanced math concepts effortlessly, and yet trapped in a system that left him behind. For the first time, Blake understood that the problem was not capacity, but opportunities. The rest of the afternoon passed faster than he expected. Jamal didn't need help to learn. He needed a shortcut to knowledge. Blake realized that his role there wasn't so much to teach, but to facilitate access to material that had always been abundant for him. The feeling of uselessness he expected to feel never came. Instead, there was a different discomfort, something he couldn't name, but that settled deep in his mind. Before leaving, he watched Jamal take an old calculus book from the makeshift library shelf and leaf through it attentively. The cover was torn, some pages loose. Blake frowned. "Do you use that to study?" "It's the only one we have," Jamal replied, without taking his eyes off the book. Blake had never needed to study with an old book. When he wanted something new, all he had to do was ask for it. That reality seemed so far removed from his own that he didn't even know how to react. For a moment, he thought about commenting that it was absurd, but something told him that Jamal didn't need his indignation. He needed resources. Blake said goodbye without a word, but as he left the riverside that afternoon, he felt that something inside him had changed. The next morning, Blake returned to Westmont as if nothing had happened. The impeccable suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, the relaxed posture. The Riverside Community Center was just a temporary detour in his routine, a task imposed by Miss Taylor that would soon be a thing of the past. At least that's what he told himself. But as he walked through Westmont's pristine corridors, an uncomfortable, persistent thought hammered in his head. The air-conditioned classrooms, the private tutors at hand, the library with books updated every semester. Everything seemed excessive in a way he had never noticed before. At lunch, he sat with his friends, the same ones as always. Young heirs of fortunes, future CEOs and senators, talking about investments, travel, and the latest political scandals involving their parents. Nothing in the conversation should have sounded strange to Blake, but suddenly the words seemed empty. While one of the guys was talking about how his parents had donated millions to a charity just to get a tax break, Blake remembered Jamal holding that old, torn book. The contrast hit him like a punch in the stomach. "Hey, you're quiet today," commented Nathan, one of the few Blake considered a true friend. Blake blinked several times, trying to push the thoughts away. "I'm just tired," he replied, taking an apple from the cart. But he wasn't just tired. For the first time, he felt disconnected from the world around him. That afternoon, during English class, Miss Taylor continued as if nothing had happened. She presented excerpts from Les Miserables, discussing how Jean Valjean was condemned for stealing a loaf of bread, while the truly corrupt in society never faced consequences. It was a topic that, normally, Blake would have ignored, making jokes to deflect attention. But this time, the words stayed with him. He was surprised thinking about the riverside, about Jamal, and about the fact that if someone like him had been born in a place like that, he probably wouldn't be sitting there, discussing literature in an elite school. When Miss Taylor opened the floor for debate, Blake remained silent. For the first time, he didn't quite know what to say. He realized that many of his classmates talked about injustice as a distant concept, something abstract, with no real impact on their lives. He felt irritation growing within him. How could they discuss inequality without having seen up close what it meant? After class, when everyone left, Miss Taylor stayed at the desk, organizing some papers. Blake hesitated, but finally approached. "Have you ever seen a student take so long to finish an alternative assignment?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. Miss Taylor looked at him with a slight smile. "Depends. Do you still believe that you have nothing to learn from this experience?" Blake crossed his arms, not replying. For the first time, Miss Taylor didn't expect a sarcastic retort. She simply went back to organizing her things, as if she knew that his silence was answer enough. Blake didn't understand why this bothered him so much. He had always been good at ignoring things he wasn't interested in, but this time, his mind seemed incapable of disconnecting. When he got home that night, he sat at the dining table with his parents and his younger sister, surrounded by the golden glow of the crystal chandelier and the muted sound of silver cutlery against expensive porcelain. His father was talking about the campaign for governor, discussing about political strategies and the tax advantages of certain alliances. Blake listened, but for the first time, the senator's words seemed disconnected from the reality that he now knew existed. "Blake, are you paying attention?" His father's firm voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, noticing that everyone at the table was staring at him. "Yes, sorry. What did you say?" The senator sighed, adjusting the cuffs of his impeccably pressed shirt. "I was talking about our charity foundation. We are closing a deal to sponsor a charity event at the university. Great publicity, good connections." Blake frowned. "What kind of charity?" His father smiled. "Oh, the usual. Symbolic scholarships, social events, maybe a gala dinner. Nothing that requires much commitment, of course. Just enough to seem engaged." The irritation Blake felt was instantaneous, but he struggled to keep a neutral expression. All of that seemed like a game he no longer wanted to be a part of. The next morning, Blake returned to the riverside, convinced that he would finish his volunteer hours and put an end to that story once and for all. But upon arriving, he realized that something had changed in his perspective. The place that once seemed small and worn now appeared full of life, of people with stories he had never taken the time to listen to. Mrs. Martha assigned him a different task that time, to help Marcus, a 14-year-old chess prodigy. Blake rolled his eyes. "Seriously? Chess?" Marcus, sitting at a table with a worn chessboard in front of him, shrugged. "If you want to give up, go ahead. But I'll warn you, no one here beats me." The confident tone surprised Blake. He sat down and observed the board for a moment before moving the first piece. The game started slowly, but it soon became clear that Marcus played at a level Blake hadn't expected. Every move the boy made was calculated, cold, and precise. In less than 10 minutes, Blake found himself cornered. "Checkmate," said Marcus, with a slight smile. Blake blinked, incredulous. "How did you become so good at this?" "By practicing," Marcus replied. "But it would be better if I had a computer to play against stronger opponents." Blake looked around. The Riverside Library barely had books in good condition, and far fewer computers to train on chess. "Have you never played online?" "Only when a teacher lets me use the cell phone for a few minutes. But you can't really compete that way." Blake didn't know what to say. Once again, he realized that what those kids lacked wasn't talent or effort, it was structure. As he left the Riverside that afternoon, Blake felt something different. For the first time, he wasn't just fulfilling the hours of a challenge imposed by Miss Taylor, he was paying attention. Until then, his life had been like a game where the pieces were already set to guarantee his victory. But Marcus, Jamal, and so many other children there were playing the same game with missing pieces, against an invisible opponent who always seemed one step ahead. On his way home, Blake took out his cell phone and began researching. In less than 5 minutes, he found websites where he could buy used computers at ridiculously low prices, amounts that he would spend without a second thought in one night with his friends. That realization made him uncomfortable. He had always thought that charity was something distant, something his family used for self-promotion. But what if helping was as simple as stopping buying a pair of new sneakers and using that money to change someone's reality? That night, lying in the bed of his luxurious room, Blake stared at the ceiling. The experience at the Riverside forced him to face an uncomfortable truth. He wasn't better than anyone there. He had only been born with advantages that others would never have. And what if all of that was nothing more than an illusion? What if all his success, all his security, was just a reflection of the opportunities he received without effort? For the first time in his life, he felt a real weight on his shoulders. And it wasn't the pressure to live up to his family's expectations, but the weight of a conscience awakening. The next day, without telling anyone, Blake bought a notebook and returned to the Riverside. Blake arrived at the Riverside holding the notebook box as if he were carrying something forbidden. He had never done anything like this before, helping someone without expecting anything in return. When he entered the makeshift library, he saw Marcus, as usual, focused on a chessboard scribbled with a pen on the sides. The boy didn't even notice his presence until Blake placed the box on the table. "What's this?" asked Marcus suspiciously. "A notebook. Now you can play against whoever you want." The boy's eyes widened, and he remained silent for a few seconds, as if he needed to process what was happening. "Are you joking with me?" Blake shrugged. "If you don't want it, I can take it back." Before he could pretend to pick up the box, Marcus took the computer as if it were a trophy. "Wow, is this for real?" Blake nodded. He expected an explosion of joy, but Marcus continued to stare at the notebook in silence, his fingers running over the cover as if fearing it might disappear. Finally, the boy looked up and said something that completely surprised Blake. "No one ever did something like this for me." That phrase struck him harder than any checkmate Marcus had ever delivered. Blake had never needed to question whether someone would do something for him. He only knew that there would always be someone to help him, to guide his way. But for Marcus, a simple notebook represented an opportunity that once seemed impossible. Blake left the riverside that day without telling Miss Taylor or anyone else. He didn't want recognition. For the first time, he did something just because it was the right thing to do. Blake tried to continue his routine normally in the following days, but something in him no longer fit in the world he belonged to. At Westmont, everything seemed designed to perpetuate the idea that they were the best, the most prepared, the most deserving of success. But now he knew that wasn't true. He knew there were kids as brilliant as him, or even more so, who would never have a fair chance simply because they were born on the wrong side of the city. He wanted to ignore it, to go on living as he always had, but his mind wouldn't let him. The discomfort grew. Then, without telling anyone, he returned to the riverside. This time it wasn't out of obligation. He began arriving before the scheduled time, helping wherever he could. He talked with Jamal about his aspirations in engineering and pointed out study materials that he himself used. He played games with Marcus, who now spent his afternoons training online against opponents from different parts of the world. Gradually, he began to see those students not as strangers from a distant reality, but as people with dreams and abilities as legitimate as any Westmont students. But what impressed him the most was Zora. She was only 8 years old, with voluminous hair tied in 2 buns and eyes full of curiosity. Blake saw her for the first time trying to copy words from a grammar book, her tongue slightly sticking out as she wrote with concentration. When he asked her what she was doing, she answered without hesitation, "I want to be a writer." The phrase was said with such certainty that Blake almost laughed, but he held back. Instead, he pulled up a chair and asked, "What do you like to write?" Zora blinked several times, surprised that someone would take a genuine interest. Then she pulled out an old notebook and showed him her stories. They were good. Very good. Blake realized that this little girl had a natural talent, a way of narrating that conveyed emotion in a manner he had never imagined for someone her age. But what surprised him even more was the scribbled note at the end of the last page. "Maybe someday I can write a real book." At that moment, Blake understood. It wasn't just a matter of talent. It was a matter of believing that a different future was possible. That night, Blake couldn't stop thinking about Zora, about the conviction in her words when she said she wanted to be a writer, about the way she scribbled words in her notebook, as if each sentence were a bridge to a future whose existence she wasn't even sure of yet. He wondered how many other children like her had dreams that would never come true because no one told them it was possible. The next day, before heading to Westmont, Blake did something he had never done before. He stopped by a bookstore and bought a new notebook and a set of colored pens. He didn't think much about it. He just acted. After class, he went straight to the riverside and found Zora in her usual spot, absorbed in her old notebook. "Hey, little writer," he greeted her, placing the package on the table. Zora blinked several times before gingerly touching the new notebook, as if it were a fragile treasure. "What's this?" "Your first real book." She opened the cover and ran her fingers over the blank pages, her mouth agape in astonishment. "Can I write in here?" Blake laughed. "That's the point, isn't it?" Zora didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of admiration and doubt, as if trying to understand why someone like him, coming from such a different world, would care about her. Then, without saying another word, she took one of the colored pens and began to write. That night, Blake realized he was doing something he had never done before, truly caring. He no longer saw those visits to the riverside as a task imposed by Miss Taylor. He went because he wanted to be there, because he wanted to see Jamal progress in his studies, Marcus face online opponents, and Zora write her stories with a confidence that grew every day. But something deeper was happening within him, something he couldn't name, but that was changing the way he saw the world. And of course, that wouldn't go unnoticed. The next day at Westmont, his friends began to notice his absence from the usual events. He no longer showed much interest in conversations about million-dollar investments or the private parties held in mansions in the Hamptons. Nathan, his closest friend, was the first to question him. "Hey, what's up with you today? You always disappear after class." Blake hesitated for a moment. He could simply invent an excuse, say he was busy with some academic project or something similar, but for the first time, he felt that he didn't want to hide the truth. "I've been spending time at the Riverside Community Center." Nathan frowned as if he hadn't heard well. "Riverside? You mean that place on the outskirts?" "Yes." His friend laughed, shaking his head. "You're joking, right?" But Blake wasn't. And for the first time, he realized that some people would never understand. Nathan kept laughing, but the expression on his face showed that he didn't really find it funny. "Have you lost your mind, man? What the hell are you doing in that corner of the world?" Blake took a deep breath. He knew that any attempt at an explanation would sound absurd to someone like Nathan, someone who had never needed to question anything beyond the next international trip or social event. "I'm helping some kids, that's all." Nathan raised his eyebrows. "Why?" Blake hesitated. He wanted to say it was because it made sense. Because for the first time he saw things clearly. But deep down, he knew Nathan would never understand. Just because. Nathan let out an exaggerated sigh. "Man, do you realize how weird that sounds? We were born into this world to be on top. There's no point wasting time with people who will never get there." Blake felt his stomach churn. For the first time, those words, which he had heard so many times before, sounded rotten. As if they were hiding a lie he could no longer be part of. "Maybe that's the problem," he murmured, more to himself than to Nathan. His friend only laughed again, not noticing the change in Blake's gaze. But Blake did notice. He was changing, and there was no turning back. In the following days, Blake noticed that things at Westmont were different for him. Or perhaps it was he who was changing. The conversations in the hallways, which once seemed so natural, now felt empty. The way his classmates talked about the world, as if everything were a chessboard where they started with the best pieces, began to irritate him in a way it never had before. He didn't know exactly what to do with it. Everything he had always believed was crumbling before his eyes. And as uncomfortable as it was, he didn't want to turn a blind eye again. At the end of the week, he returned to the Riverside. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. When he arrived, he found Miss Taylor organizing some books. She looked at him with that look of someone who always knew that this moment would come. "Are you ready to face what's coming?" she asked without mincing words. Blake took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I am." She smiled slightly and handed him an envelope. "Then I think this might help you." Blake opened it and saw a detailed document with the Riverside's expenses, the funding rejections, and the frustrated attempts to obtain support from private institutions. Among the names of the organizations that had refused to help the community center, one stood out: his own family's charity foundation. Blake felt his stomach churn. The war against the system that had always favored his family was becoming personal. Blake held the paper tighter than he intended. That document not only proved that the Wellington Foundation had never supported real educational initiatives, but it also showed that they had directly rejected funding requests more than once. And the worst part? The justification was always the same. It does not fit the profile of projects supported by the foundation. He felt a knot of rage in his stomach. His father talked so much about social commitment, about how the Wellington family took pride in helping the community, but it was all just a facade. They had never intended to change anything. "How did you get this?" he asked, still looking at the papers. Miss Taylor smiled slightly. "I have my contacts, but that's not important. The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" Blake already knew the answer before he even thought about it. He could simply confront his father again, try to convince him once more, but he already knew what the response would be. So no, he wouldn't try to convince him. He would explain the truth. The next morning, Blake sent copies of the document to the student council, attaching a clear message. "This is proof that the Wellington Foundation has never supported real educational initiatives. If we still want to continue this alliance, we'll have to act on our own." The reactions were immediate. Some students were shocked, others skeptical, but most importantly, the truth was spreading. And Blake was ready to bring it to the public. Blake knew he was playing a dangerous game. Exposing his own family meant putting his name against everything that had always guaranteed his safety and privileges. But for the first time, he no longer wanted to hide behind the Wellington surname. The perfect opportunity came a few days later, when the school organized an annual event to present the social projects supported by Westmont. The main hall was full of influential parents, business people, members of the press, and of course his own father, who was about to give a speech about the Wellington family's commitment to education. When it was his turn to speak, Blake went up on stage with the documents in his hand. "Everyone here knows my family's foundation," he began, keeping his voice steady. "We have always heard about how much we do for education, about how we support noble causes, but the truth is very different." A silence spread through the hall. His father, seated in the first row, lifted his head, alert. "During the past few weeks, I have been involved in a project at the Riverside Community Center, a place that fights to offer quality education to brilliant children, but that is constantly ignored by institutions that claim to support education. And do you know which foundation refused to help more than once?" Blake raised the documents. "The Wellington Foundation." A murmur went through the audience. His father sat still, eyes fixed on him. Some teachers exchanged uneasy glances, but Blake did not back down. "It's time to stop pretending that small donations for luxurious events are enough. It's time to use the resources we have to create real opportunities for those in need." He stared fixedly at his father before concluding, "And I will begin now." The impact was immediate. The audience was divided between astonishment, admiration, and bewilderment. Senator Wellington hardened his expression into a mask of contained fury. But Blake didn't care anymore. He had done what he had to do. The hall erupted in murmurs, and Blake felt the tension building around him like a wave about to break. But curiously, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he no longer worried about the consequences. His father, on the other hand, stood up in a controlled manner, but the look he gave him was pure fire. "Blake," said Senator Wellington, his voice low but laden with threat, "we can talk about this in private." Blake held the microphone firmly. "I think that conversation should be public, Dad." The school principal tried to intervene, but it was already too late. The damage was done. Some students began to applaud timidly, and, soon, the sound took over the room. It was an applause of defiance, of support for change. Blake felt a lump in his throat, but he maintained his stance. He wasn't alone. His father, seeing that he had lost control of the situation, abruptly turned and left the hall without saying another word. But Blake knew that it wouldn't end there. Later that night, his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw his father's name. He took a deep breath before answering. "You just made a grave mistake." The senator's voice was cold. Blake looked out the window, beyond the walls of the mansion where he had grown up. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe it was the first right thing I've ever done in my life." The call ended immediately. But Blake didn't back down. He was ready to face whatever came next. In the days that followed, the impact of Blake's speech was felt throughout the school and beyond. Some teachers began to support the initiative. Students who had never been interested in social issues started discussing inequality and opportunities more seriously. But most surprisingly was the effect on the Riverside. The following week, when Blake arrived at the community center, he found Jamal, Marcus, and Zora waiting for him. "Did you really do it?" Jamal asked, holding a newspaper with a headline about his speech. Blake smiled. "I did, but this is just the beginning." Zora held the notebook that he had given her. "Can I write about this?" Blake crouched down to her level and smiled. "You can write about whatever you want." The transformation he had initiated wouldn't change the world overnight. There would still be resistance, challenges, people trying to stop him. But Blake knew he couldn't go back. He no longer wanted to be just a Wellington. He wanted to be the change. And for the first time, he felt that it was possible.